Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today we're going to talk about how to build a Prestige library. And Prestige is, again, one of the great labels of the jazz canon. It's a tougher one to get a grasp on in some ways than Blue Note or even Riverside. Riverside's body of work is kind of finite. 300, 400 records between Jazzline and Riverside. Blue Notes, 500-600 records before the sale if you include early 10-inch work. With Prestige, it's a longer term. There's more 10-inch material out there and 78 material than either Riverside or Blue Note. And then there's a lot in the 7000 series that runs clear up to 7800. Then it starts a new sequence and continues on from there. That gets us, of course, into the mid to late 70s. They also launched a new jazz sequence, which we'll talk about in a separate episode. Very modern, a little bit more edge of the avant-garde on the new jazz label. The stuff it was called New Jazz by Bob Weinstock for a reason. It was a bit more edgy stuff. And the main label, when it first launched the 7000 series, was kind of housing Sonny Rollins, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, a lot of great names. And those names all move on to other labels, greener pastures. And a lot of that material is even before the 7000 series launches. The Monk stuff's recorded in the early 50s and comes out on the LP. So it's a convoluted beast, but it certainly has a number of great trajectories, and they firmly establish some genres and parts of the jazz scene as good as anybody does in some ways, especially with the soul jazz in the 60s. They're at the forefront of that whole movement. And that soul jazz movement, it helps keep Prestige alive. Those records sold relatively well, and the 45s ended up in jukeboxes. There was a demand in black and white neighborhoods for the soul jazz. So that stuff has a pretty strong legacy and a pretty strong track record, in spite of the fact that collectors today kind of ignore it, which is a little puzzling because it's almost all really fun, very accessible, blues, gospel tinged, R&B tinged, fun, loose, honest expression. Listening to soul jazz at Prestige, there's not a lot of oversight, there's not a lot of rehearsal. So a lot of it's very much just this loose shooting from the hip and an honest kind of comfortable emoting, not challenging myself too much. So I'm going to stay within my realm because I don't have a retake. You know what I mean? This is going to be it. So again, Prestige is tough to get a real grasp on because there's so many titles. There are 800 plus in the 7000 sequence alone, nearly 100 in the New Jazz 8200 sequence. And then the Swingville and Moodsville sequences also have a large body of work, and we'll cover those and the New Jazz in a separate episode. So we're just going to talk 7000 series. And remember, a lot of the 7000 series is going to be stuff from early in the 50s that they're repackaging in the LP era. And be careful with Prestige. They will repackage the same music over and over and over with different numbers, different covers, different people giving credit as the leader. And so you'll come home with the same Sonny Rollins record 3 different ways just to find out it's all the same stuff from the same session back in 54. And so there's no shortage of that at Prestige. And as the 7000 series moves forward, there's dozens of titles that are just repackagings of earlier material from both the 10-inch era and even the early 7000 series. By the 72, 7300s, they're reissuing some of that stuff. And some of it's giving it a stereo version with a new cover. Some of it's just repackaging something because so-and-so got hot at a different label. And, oh, yeah, we recorded them back in 56. Let's reissue that now. So there's a lot of convolution going on that takes quite a while to grasp and get a handle on. I try to always get the earliest version of an LP with any label. I have the first 300 titles in the 7000 sequence. I'm missing any aside from a few repackagings of earlier stuff I don't have. But for the most part, a couple of greatest hits too. But for the most part, I have every title up to about 7350. That's original work. And then again, up until 7,800. There's hundreds more, plus new jazz. I have close to 600 Prestige titles. It's an incredible body of work. And Weinstock seems less invested in the product in terms of its meaning, its purpose, its expression. He seems much more just interested in the bottom line and churning things through and keeping those doors open and letting people coming in and recording all hours and just putting stuff out relentlessly. It's a pretty steady stream of material, and it's certainly one of the most preeminent names as you come into jazz. We'll know Columbia, we'll know some of those big labels like Blue Note, and then Prestige is kind of right there on that next doorstep for us to walk through and get into and discover. Weinstock is an interesting character in the history of jazz, a big Jewish fella. He didn't have the best track record in terms of race relations, but that's not an uncommon thing in the music industry then, probably even as it is now. It's a great label though, and I've talked about Prestige a lot over the years, so let's just dive in. And picking 24 titles here was tough, and so I tended to go towards one of the early years of the label, the first 5-10 years or so of the LP era, 55 to 65 or so. And again, the stuff goes much further than that, and there is a lot of stuff from before 55, 10-inch, and 78. And a lot of that stuff did get reissued on the LP. So we're just going to focus on the 7000 series today. And let's just jump in from right there. By the way, we're listening to a nice old copy of Miles Davis's Blue Haze. This is culled from 3 different sessions. I think Horace Silver's on some of this. I think Charles Mingus is on some of this. I think Davey Schildkraut, a great West Coast sax player, is on a couple tracks. Art Blakey, there's some interesting people on these tracks. But it's a nice, moody, kind of rainy day Miles Davis session. And that's the thing about Prestige records, is they lack a political social consciousness and an intensity that a lot of Blue Note records have. And so when I end up listening to Blue Note records, I end up often getting sucked into this train of thought that propels me down the avenues of social consciousness and awareness and race and tension and economics. All that stuff comes to my mind. Listen to the intensity and the aggression of a Blue Note session. With Prestige, that's a much more cool East Coast. It's smooth. It's rarely got the same political social charge to it in my sensory perceptions. Others might feel different about that, but it all feels kind of loose, kind of fun. If New York is dark and Gotham on Blue Note, here New York seems lighter and there's more fun in the park to be had. It's just got a lighter feel to it. And I would say Riverside's closer to Blue Note in terms of its intensity, in terms of its socially conscious awareness and the message it's trying to, I feel, get across. I don't feel with Prestige you're ever really getting a whole lot of message. It doesn't really come across to me much ever. And you actually get a lot of really loose sessions that have a lot of freedom to just play the blues, but lack direction and propulsion in that sense. So to start a Prestige discography / collection library, there's really 4 titles you need to start with. I'm going to count this as 1 because it's all from the same 2-day session, and they're legendary records by a legendary group that was really the last moment these 2 guys were even that Prestige. And Miles makes a long track record of recordings at Prestige in the early 50s. And what we kind of forget is Miles was rather obscure in the early 50s. It was him playing at Newport that really opened the eyes of the media and Columbia Records when they signed him in 55, that really kind of propels Miles to that next stage. But in the early 50s, his Prestige work is, a lot of it's with disparate membership and different sessions pieced together. It doesn't have a seeming sense of direction. He was kind of lagging in the polls and the public opinion. He was about to have this incredible resurgence because of playing at Newport and the spark that he put out that day. But he was really kind of not the figure that we think of him as today in 51, 52, 53. His career was very much in a lull. And in 55, he signs with Columbia. And he can't wait to get there to make that new money, first of all. Probably 3-4 times what he was getting paid at a small indie label like Prestige. And he owes Prestige still 4 records on his record contract with them. And so he calls the Great Quintet into the studio, which of course is Red Garland, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, Philly Joe Jones, John Coltrane, and himself. And they have been playing live a lot. They haven't been recording a ton, but they've been playing live a lot. And they basically take their live repertoire into the studio and just cut these tracks that they've been killing in the clubs for over a year. And they just blister through, in 2 days, all these tracks. And they become 4 sessions that are released over the course of time. This is 7166, Working with Miles Davis. This is 7129, Relaxing with Miles Davis. This is Cooking, 7094, which I think is the first one to come out. And then Steamin', 7200, which I think is the last one to be released. It's all the same 5 guys, all from the same 2-day session. It really needs to be packaged at some point as a great quadruple record, double CD, something like that. Because they're really very in step with each other. They feel very, well, they're from the same session, so they feel that way. And it's as good a place to start with Prestige as anything. Cooking, Working, Steamin', Relaxing are masterpieces of loose, yet well rehearsed, well interspoken between each other kind of dialogue. These guys are really comfortable with, familiar with each other, and really a lot of the best jazz comes from that familiarity of me knowing exactly where you're going to be, me throwing the ball behind my back and you're there to catch it and turn the double play. Like, these guys have a camaraderie at this point, and Coltrane and Miles are a great dichotomy. Coltrane's this great light, this optimism, this power. Miles is this great negativity, this small, dark force. And they really kind of counter each other, and bringing yin and yang to the fore in the rhythm section is pretty much a Hall of Fame rhythm section. So you can't go wrong with any of those 4 records. This is Lights Out by Jackie McLean. And before Jackie McLean goes to Blue Note and makes his great string of rather groundbreaking, edge of the avant-garde, modern jazz, he makes a number of recordings at Prestige and New Jazz. And this is Lights Out, number 7035. And it might actually be from 2 sessions. No, I don't think it's 1. With Jackie McLean, Donald Byrd, Elmo Hope, Doug Watkins, and Art Taylor. And those guys kind of worked together quite a bit for a little bit there. It's great early hard bop. There's no avant-garde yet. It's still very much just a propulsed, aggressive. This is some of the more aggressive stuff you'll hear on the Prestige label, Jackie McLean's work. And he goes, like I said, to Blue Note by 5960, and he changes his sound somewhat when he gets there. And they seem a lot more thought out and meditated, those records, once he gets there. This is Benny Green with Art Farmer. And this is a tough record to come by. One of the benefits of collecting Prestige is few titles have been reissued as often as a lot of the Prestige catalog. Blue Note and Prestige, probably of all the small jazz labels, have the largest percentages of their catalog available. Blue Note's the highest. The Japanese, they can put pretty much everything out, as well as other people have as well. But with Prestige, especially the early stuff, OJC recaptured so much of that stuff. This is one of the titles I don't think OJC did. And it's a very expensive, hard to find record by Benny Green. Art Farmer, of course, is one of the great trumpet players of this era, who was very much on par with Donald Byrd and Miles Davis at this point. Again, Miles Davis's place in the jazz canon, in the jazz kingdom, is a lot different today than it was in 1955. Cliff Small's on the piano, Addison Farmer's on the bass, and then Philly Joe Jones is on the drums. Philly Joe's on a lot of Prestige records, as is Paul Chambers. It's a cool cover, and I want to play a little bit off that once this Miles is wrapped up. It took me a long time to track that one down. 70-43, and it's got a similar lineup to what we just saw with Donald Byrd, Hank Mobley, John Coltrane, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones, Elmo Hopes, and Formal Jazz. This came out later again as, I believe, two tenors with the Mobley and the Coltrane, both having some popularity, especially Coltrane. It got repackaged as two tenors, and Elmo Hope was the leader, gets regulated down to sideman on the next reissue of this, which that's a little unjust. I think it's an Elmo Hope record. It should be packaged this way, and honestly, this cover is as good as any cover in the Prestige canon, and so you should always try to find this version of this. Of course, the two tenors is going to have come out 10 years later, and will probably be quite a bit more affordable, but this record cooks. Elmo Hope's a serious New York-born piano player. He's got some edges of Monk, just like Herbie Nichols and some of those other cats in that scene, but he's also a very spatially conscious and grooving some Horace Silver type patterns as well. And so it's a very, again, a fairly aggressive Prestige session, which there's stuff in this time frame that's definitely not that. Two trumpets. Again, this is Art Farmer and Donald Byrd. And again, these guys were pretty much in the same light at that point. Byrd in 58 here, maybe 57 even probably. He's not gone to Blue Note yet. He has played with the Jazz Messengers on Columbia, and then he goes out with Horace Silver for a while, and then he ends up doing some stuff at different labels, including a few records as a leader at Prestige. And they're not Mobley's best work, but they're still fine Hank Mobley records. Mobley doesn't really make bad records. He just makes good and better, you know. But this is a great session, a great cover. Reed Miles does do some covers for Prestige, if I recall, but by no means is he the powerful force here that he is at Blue Note. Let's see if it has the cover. Doesn't say. But again, Jackie McLean, Doug Watkins, Barry Harrison, Art Taylor. So with Prestige, like the other labels, when you're making records at that label, you're going to be recruited to do a lot of side work as well. And a lot of these guys were on junk at the time, and so getting paid daily to go buy your heroin was a formula that worked for a lot of them just fine. 70-64, A Garland of Red, a tough record to find. Again, OJC did reissue this one, but it's with just a trio setting with Paul Chambers and Art Taylor. Garland, anything Garland trio, I can't say this enough. If you're a fan of melody and nice pocket grooves and an early Sunday morning rain at dawn, Red Garland's records will fill that bill better than almost anything or anyone out there. Like, he's the perfect guy to have. He's the perfect guy to have if you have a Sunday morning and you just want something kind of melancholic and dreamy to help lift the drear of the gray. Garland's just a beautiful player. He had a falling out with Miles, as a lot of Miles people seem to do, and Miles ended up firing him for Wynton Kelly. But Garland's body of work at Prestige is immense. It's all noteworthy and worthy of owning. There's a few records that include Donald Byrd and John Coltrane that are somewhat different than most of the trio stuff that he does. Those are outstanding. Soul Junction and High Pressure, I think they're called. Those are both great records. But it's really the trio stuff, I think, that you want to seek out and get to know Red. You know, again, you're pretty much talking Miles Davis rhythm section on a lot of them. Art Taylor's on the drums on this one. And Art Taylor's a name that is everywhere in jazz in this moment in time. But again, I'm a huge Red Garland fan. A lot of his albums at Prestige are some of my favorite records. This is the Benny Green record. And Benny Green's not like J.J. Johnson or Curtis Fuller, where he's just an explosive, dynamic player. He's much more melodic, much smoother, much more playing from a soulful R&B type of place. Moving along here, Thelonious Monk with Sonny Rollins, 70-75. This, again, is stuff that came out in the early 50s from numerous different sessions. And Rollins and Monk are an interesting foil for each other. They actually work pretty darn well. It takes a lot of listening, I think, to hear Monk and then to know exactly what to say after. And for a lot of people, some of Rollins' most interesting stuff and some of the stuff he does with Monk early in the 50s, some of the Miles. He seems to be in a fairly powerful charge position right then in terms of how he feels about himself. Monk is an unknown still. These are from the early 50s. He's had 2 sessions at Blue Note that went nowhere, didn't have much publicity on them. And then he goes to Prestige and makes a number of sessions there that were 10 inches that turn into 3 different LPs. They're all worth getting, either the 10 inches or the 3 LPs that have the 10 inches called onto them. In hindsight, Monk's Blue Note and Prestige stuff is seen as brilliant. It was overlooked at the time. The critics didn't have much comprehension of it. He goes to Riverside in 58, or maybe 56, and that really changes his fortunes. And Brilliant Corners and a lot of those records start having more success, more critical acclaim. The jazz collectors, the jazz media recognize that Monk's doing something interesting, and Monk's form of the avant-garde and the weird, the edges of Monk starts becoming something that a lot of people want to get to recognize. And Monk's place in jazz is so important. He's on my jazz Mount Rushmore, along with Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Charlie Parker. I think his contribution to modern jazz, in terms of, and not just jazz, but all music, his bringing of dissonance and strange irregular times, and the way he kind of blocks and chops and attacks melody and rhythm with his Monkisms, they're all really unique. And there's a ton of alternative music in a lot of genres that I feel Monk deserves recognition as being one of the innovators of that, because there isn't a lot of dissonance in music in the 40s and 50s. Ellington delves in it, but it's Monk who comes along in a minimal sense, chops and dissects, reduces it down to its bare minimum, uses the pieces that of the puzzle that he thinks that are interesting. And there's a ton of rock and pop and R&B and jazz that all borrow from what Monk dictated. It's pretty outstanding and kind of goes unsaid a lot. One of the great Prestige records is 70-79, Saxophone Colossus. This should be in every record collection. It's just a fantastic record, a very focused Sonny Rollins with Doug Watkins, Tommy Flanagan, and Max Roach. It's just beautiful, it's poignant. It's got some up-tempo charge to it and some beautiful ballads as well. St. Thomas is one of his real standards. Blue Seven's just a gorgeous piece. You Don't Know What Love is amazing. This record is one of the great records in the Prestige catalog that stands on its own. Isn't a guy elevating himself to another place like Miles or Coltrane. This is his best work here at Prestige. And there's not a lot of cats, not Monk, not Miles, not Coltrane. Most of those guys go on to make more important stuff elsewhere. Prestige was a stepping stone. And Rollins makes a lot of great work after this, no question. But I think most people agree that this is his magnus opus, his finest moment. And Prestige allowed him to just kind of go and do what he wanted. And he had a moment of brilliance that's just such a beautiful session. And it should be in every jazz collection. And it should be a record that people who aren't even jazz fans could get into and approach. It's a very accessible piece. Gene Ammons, Funky, 70-83. This is kind of the beginning of the soul jazz movement already at Prestige. Ammons comes from the bebop school and he can really blow, but he's also got a ton of soul, a ton of grits and barbecue. He's just got blues pouring out of him, and he's got a bad drug habit to boot. He actually goes to jail for quite a long stretch in the 60s. But Ammons' body of work at Prestige, A, it's voluminous, there's a lot of it. But B, it's all affordable for old Prestige records. $100 for an original pressing of some of these. That's not bad for an old Prestige record. And you can find rougher shaped copies for $30-40. And they're all fun. They're all filled with the blues. They all make you want to shake a tambourine and say, hallelujah. You know what I mean? He's just the gospel of soul jazz. And I think the success Ammons has is one of the things that propels Prestige to dive deeper into that realm and to kind of ignore the trends that were happening in jazz and to rather put new modern stuff on the new jazz imprint and keep the 7000 series for what was going to become a very soul jazz oriented label by 7150 through 7500. And there's pieces in there that aren't soul jazz. We'll talk about some of them, but a lot of that stuff is very much fun, easy to get into, not that expensive, good stuff. 7084. This is a tough record to find. Oleo by Thad Jones, Frank West, Teddy Charles, Doug Watkins, and Mal Waldron. One thing Prestige does a lot is they just record whoever's in the studio that day, put them in the room together, and they come out without having a real leader to the session. Kenny Burrell, earthy, all day long, all night long. There's a lot of records that weren't really designated as so-and-so being a leader, and this is one of them. It's just kind of equally billing for all 5 of them. And it's kind of since become thought of as a Thad Jones record, probably because his name is mentioned first. But again, this record can go for hundreds of bucks all day long. It's a great session. It's loose, doesn't feel super orchestrated or produced. It just feels like 5 cats playing. And there's a refreshing honesty to that at times. You know, the right players who have good chemistry can pull that off, and it'd be a fantastic thing. In the 7100s now, this is Coltrane's 7105. It's his first solo record, and it's a record that all people should get because it's Coltrane's debut as a leader, essentially. It's not a unified session with the same group from one recording session. It's from 2 or 3 different sessions. There's a few different lineups here, so it doesn't have the cohesiveness necessarily of, say, a Blue Note, Blue Trane. You know, this is a lot more, I wouldn't say pieced together, but it certainly has just enough tracks to make a record, is all Bob Weinstock wanted. But you see already the meditative, focused, Denzel Washington's going to play me someday in a movie look on young John Coltrane's face. Coltrane's an intense cat. And most people who are going to be watching this are going to be well familiar with John Coltrane, so I don't need to go into any kind of depth on that. But Coltrane's intensity, his spirituality, his want to explore the cosmos and understand his place and search for meaning, his eventual mortality, it all is part of his incredible process. And to have early parts of Coltrane's process, they are important. And Coltrane's a lot different player here than he is by the time Giant Steps comes along in 59. He's a lot different player here than he is compared to when he's at Impulse in the 60s. Like, there's a great variance to Coltrane's career. It never really stagnates or stays in one place for any length of time. Curtis Fuller, New Trombone 7107, one of my favorite Prestige album covers. It's fantastic. Kind of captures that mid-century rail-controlled world that we lived in. Sonny Red is on this on the alto, a great player. Doug Watkins, Louis Hayes, and Hank Jones make up the rhythm section. Hank Jones, we've all known as one of my favorite piano players ever. Doug Watkins, one of the great bass players who died too young. And of course, the great Louis Hayes. Just a great session. He's, at this point, I think this is before, I think this might be before his Blue Note stuff. Because he comes to Blue Note in 56 or 7. I have to look again, I don't remember. Yeah, I just quick checked. This does predate his Blue Note stuff. I thought it did, along with a new jazz session with Red Garland, which is also a great record. Tough to come by. This is an OJC pressing of it. I've not seen an old one of this, maybe about one time. Fuller goes to Blue Note shortly after this, and then to Savoy, and he makes what are kind of his most famous records. But this is definitely one worth seeking out. The lineup alone is just fantastic with Sonny Red. So there's some early Curtis Fuller. It's worth having. Tommy Flanagan, one of the great players from the bebop era, moves into the hard bop and postmodern era, and he really is playing a beautiful lyrical style of piano. He's a sideman on Infinite Sessions from stuff as disparate as Giant Steps to very beautiful, just Tommy Flanagan trio stuff. And I love them in a trio setting, like Red Garland. They got some similarities, actually, Flanagan and Garland. They're both lyrical, bluesy. They both seem to have a lot of expression in their playing and dynamic. Flanagan might be a better player, but I love them equally, and I have more of Garland's body of work. And Flanagan's work as a sideman is really Kenny Burrell-like. It's just Paul Chambers-like. He's on a lot of records as a sideman and doesn't do a lot of work as a leader. Red Garland, on the other hand, doesn't do a lot as a sideman and does almost all his work as a leader. And so you're going to kind of lean to think that Garland's a more important player from that, but that's not necessarily a measuring of a guy's ability or his playing. Some of that's just the elevated position that Miles gave him, and he was able to stipulate what he wanted. Flanagan, though, is on just so many great records. This is just a trio with Wilbur Little and Elvin Jones. Hasn't been reissued a lot. One of the coolest covers. It's called Overseas. And as you can see, it's Tommy Flanagan over a bunch of C's, the letter C. And I think it's recorded in Sweden or something, if I remember. Prestige liner notes always leave a lot to be desired. They're not quick with dates. Sometimes they don't even show sidemen. Some of it's better than others. But again, this record is probably one of the most expensive records in this era of the Prestige catalog. In the 7100s, I would reckon there's not a lot of titles in that 100 records more expensive than what this one can go for. And it's really out of the price range of most people. It does have a new modern repackaging with an alternate cover that I can't stand alternate covers. I don't care about alternate pressings as much. That's not my concern. If it's the music's there, I can hear it. You know what I mean? I love jazz in a live setting. It's not always perfectly clear. There's silverware clinking and glasses and people talking. And I don't mind a little noise during my jazz. What I don't want is the wrong album cover. I want to have the right album cover. A, it says something about the music, something about the time it was made in. B, it prevents me from buying the same record again or thinking I don't have it. I want to have the right album cover. I think it's very important. And a lot of those budget label European bootleg, as it were, albums in jazz today, the music's no longer copyrighted, but the album cover art is. So they're putting new covers on all that stuff, which that's, to me, they're good photos at least. Now we're talking about Shirley Scott. And here's 7143. This is her debut at Prestige. And she's a bad girl. She's an organ player. She has a relationship with Stanley Turrentine off and on. And they make a number of records together. She shows up on some of Stanley's Blue Notes. He shows up on some of her Prestige titles. She probably makes 15 records at Prestige in 57, 58, 59, into 60. Probably 15, 20 records. And some of those come out after she left. She goes to Impulse, and she makes a dozen records on Impulse that are also outstanding. I think her Impulse body of work has more different. That was part of the Impulse thing, was we're going to produce sessions differently with different sidemen and different. This one's going to have a Latin feel. This one's going to have a bluesy feel. This one's going to have a big orchestral feel. Impulse had a lot of oversight. At Prestige, most of it's fairly simple, guttural, blues, gospel-based soul jazz, and she's one of the great progenitors of that sound. I love her records, and you can get old Shirley Scott Prestige records for a great deal. A really affordable price. Some of them go for as little as 10, 12, 15 bucks for old, beautiful Prestige records. And I would recommend people buy her stuff. It's great. It's something you can put on when the family's barbecuing. The neighbors stop by, and I had my last episode. Boy, did that thing spill over in some weird directions. More on the Facebook groups again than on the channel itself. But boy, some people get stirred up by things I say. The amount of argument that went on in this one Facebook group about that episode that didn't even address what the episode was about. It's kind of infuriating and puzzling. And boy, sometimes people just want to vent and talk and not even talk about what the episode was about. It's insane. But Shirley Scott, great stuff. And it's accessible to anybody. And we're trying to get people to no longer squint and cringe when they say, oh, I want to put some jazz on. I don't want people cringing. I don't want people going, oh, what jazz? If more people heard more accessible jazz, it wouldn't have that reputation. And of course, media's help, portray that with the memes and the sitcoms, and it's just I don't even know. It's hard to explain sometimes how a music form that 80% of it's very accessible and easy to listen to, and is at the root of so much of the modern songwriter. The blues, the singing behind the beat, a lot of what jazz innovates, it's omnipresent in so much of modern music. It's not that hard to get into and to digest, and it's not that overwhelming. So much of it's not. How do we get to that place where so many people just think, oh, jazz, that's not for me, not even listening to it? Shirley Scott won't make them do that. Shirley Scott will make them go, oh, I like this. What is this? This is jazz? Oh, I like this. We need more of that. Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins, of course, everyone knows is one of the great tenor players of all time. One of the great innovative players of the instrument. He has a long career. He goes through the bebop era. He's playing in small groups in the 50s. He makes a great comeback record at Riverside. His body of work is quite immense. It's a bit tough to follow it because some of it's compilations and stuff that came out before the LP. Some of it's stuff that was recorded in small groups in the 50s and in the 60s. But for me, if you want to start with Coleman Hawkins anywhere, Coleman Hawkins stuff at Prestige is outstanding. And his stuff in the 7000 series is limited. Most of it's going to be in the Swingsville and the Moodsville subsidiaries, and those records are all great. And those were just records that were kind of older swing cats that were, I think they were at 50 cents or $1 less than the regular Prestige titles. And they're great records, and you can kind of find them for decent prices most of the time. But Coleman Hawkins Soul here, this one's $71.49. And again, the record of the band here was Kenny Burrell and Ray Bryant, with Wendell Marshall and O.C. Johnson, the drummer. So you got pretty much a royalty all the way around there. Burrell, Ray Bryant, O.C. Johnson, and Wendell Marshall. Yes, please. Can I have some of that? That's fun listening. Again, it's going to be accessible to near anybody. And also a great album cover. Just the man sitting there with a cigarette to his mouth. Great stuff. So, moving along, Arnett Cobb, Texas Tenorman. He has a great Illinois Jacquette kind of sound. He really propulses a thick, really melodic sense of R&B and the blues tone. He's always going to play in that kind of a sense. The fact this is called Party Time, and his next record was called More Party Time, tells you that people probably spilled some beans and barbecue sauce on these records. These are soul jazz records. They're bluesy. They're gospel inflected. They have a lot of feel. Thanks to my friend, skipping my name. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. One of my friends who I met through here recommended Trane to me, the television show. Started watching it last night, and you see how important music is in impoverished communities, and how even that New Orleans, the sense of dress and celebration and the need to have this outlet, the need to have joyful occasions to help us get through the tough. And this is post-Katrina New Orleans and Treme. It's moving, powerful stuff. I've been told to watch it numerous times. Never got around to it. Didn't have HBO a lot of time. Me and the wife started watching it last night. And Russell Lee Fine, thank you, that's my friend's name, he recommended it to me. He actually worked on the show, and he worked on The Wire as well. And boy, The Wire is one of my favorite shows of all time. But anyway, Arnett Cobb is that party time. It is that we're going to dress up and decorate and spill into the streets and march and take our brother home to the cemetery. It's just full of the joy and the essence of life. And that's what a lot of great soul jazz is. It's just capturing the essence and joy of life and helping us to overcome our struggle here in the black community. Moving along, another very important part of the soul jazz movement at Prestige is, of course, Eddie Lockjaw Davis, who makes some records as a leader, but mostly it's with Johnny Griffin. Some stuff with Shirley Scott as well, but this record with Johnny Griffin here, and they're very different players. Lockjaw's kind of loose and swinging and bluesy, and Griffin's a bit more fiery and filled with notes and expressive dynamics. but they actually kind of come together quite nicely. And they said it was never really a competition. It was more how can we enhance each other and inspire each other. Two cats I would love to spend the day with. I would love to be able to hang out in jazz heaven someday with Eddie Lockjaw Davis and chaw on some barbecue with Johnny Griffin. It's truly some of the most beautiful, soulful, genuine. There's just no pretension to it. There's no ego or intellect. It's just loose, it's raw, it's free, it's the blues. And that unadulterated expression sometimes is the most honest and just loosest release. And you get some interesting things from a person when they're not trying to put too much intellect into their playing sometimes. I love this record. I played it at my DJ gigs quite a bit. That would be Griffin right there. And Griffin's the rabbit. He just darts about, and he's just a little diminutive fella, but he expresses fast and loose. Some great piano right there. And Lockjaw's got a bit of a brighter, wider tone. Griffin's a little bit more narrow and sinuous, and Lockjaw's tone's wider and a bit more of a 4-lane highway. Willis Jackson is a great player as well, who ends up very much in the soul jazz. There's more to him than just soul jazz. This is Cook and Sherry 7211. Nice session. I found this, I believe, in Rockford, Illinois. The little record store there I found quite a bit of stuff at. Jack McDuff, Bill Jennings, Wendell Marshall, Milt Hinton, Al Johnson. Just a great lineup. You know, and Bill Jennings is that great guitar player. I talked about my jazz guitar sequence. He's just a great rhythm and blues player. Loves to lay down just color and rhythm. This is a tough record to come by. But again, most of these Prestige original pressings by this time, 7200s, $60 to $100 probably is what you have to pay for that nowadays, which isn't bad for an original pressing from that era. Again, one of the real staples of the Prestige soul jazz is brother Jack McDuff, a great organ player. And I don't want to say he's the answer to Jimmy Smith at Blue Note, because that would be a misnomer. Jimmy Smith is in all definitions a virtuistic bebop, absolutely brilliant impresario. There's nothing like Jimmy Smith. He's one of the greatest players in jazz on any instrument, period. He's as brilliant as Parker, as Dizzy Gillespie, as Clifford Brown, as any dynamic player that can explode your mind and make you go, wow, I didn't know that instrument could even do that. Jimmy Smith is that. Dry throat. He doesn't get the credit he deserves. People so much dismiss him as just being that Verve era hoochie coochie man, kind of, you know, loosely packaged poppy. And Jimmy Smith, especially at Blue Note, is not that. And people who buy early Jimmy Smiths are kind of will message me and be shocked how different their perception of Jimmy Smith was from the reality of what those records are like. Jack McDuff is not that. He's much more playing the organ as the organ kind of was always played. Going back to the days of Wild Bill Davis and even Count Basie, where it was loose, it swung, it just put color and feel. And not to say he can't play some incredible stuff, but I don't feel he's in that same... I don't think he's trying to play like Jimmy Smith. I don't think he's trying to play bebop or hard bop. He's trying to play barbecue blues and soul, and that's definitely the vibe that he fits into. Jimmy McGriff's more in that vein. A guy like Larry Young's going to be more in the Jimmy Smith vein. Johnny Hammond Smith is also, and Don Patterson are more in the Jimmy Smith vein. So there's two different camps of organ players. Maybe Face Willette is more in the Jack McDuff vein. I love McDuff. Again, you know what you're going to get from a McDuff record. It's going to smell a bit like mustard and beans. And that's okay. I love that type of stuff. And those McDuff records, again, $20, $30, you can get old McDuff records. They got to be in really, really great shape for you to pay more than $50 for an old Jack McDuff. It's got to be pristine. some seller wants $75 for an old Jack McDuff, wait, because one will come around for 40 before you know it. And they sold pretty well. Here we go, 72.25. A guy that's most of his work is on New Jazz at Prestige is Oliver Nelson, but this is one of his first at the label. And this is Afro-American Sketches, the music of Oliver Nelson. And he's a great sax player who often isn't remembered much for his sax playing. He's remembered much more for his arranging and production and his impact at Verve and at Impulse in the 60s. He ends up in the film industry doing some of that. He's a big arranger. He has a lot of ideas and sounds to him. And I'm not even a fan of some of his. He actually does a lot of arranging of some of Jimmy Smith's stuff at Verve. Don Sebesky-like. It's just full of horns and bright sounds, and some of it's really cool. Some of it has some cool dissonant edges to it, which is what partly you can do with arrangements and composition. When you start having heavy arrangements, you can put angles in there that your horn players can slide off of and create dissonance with. But this is a bit more of a straightforward session. Here he's playing with a variety of different players here. Julius Watkins is on this, Ernie Royal, Joe Newman, Joe Wilder, Herbie Green, Melba Liston, Billy Byers, Don Butterfield, Art Davis, Ed Shaughnessy, my goodness, Eric Dixon, Arthur Babe Clark. Just quite an incredible lineup of people. And that's kind of Oliver Nelson's thing. He wants a lot of pieces to work with that he can, in a sense, be a bit of a mini Ellington and really compose and arrange sound. It's much less about just playing and shouting out from your soul. Oliver Nelson is much more of a compositionally driven guy, and he wants to be sure that what the horns are saying and the strings are saying or the vibe, whatever it is, he wants these things to all kind of coalesce. And he does a good job of that. He's definitely a leader in that department. Kenny Burrell, this is actually the second cover of this, but 72-77 all day long. The title track is all whole one side. This is a classic Prestige. Whoever shows up, we're going to record them today. This is that kind of a session. But it's fantastic. You know what I mean? But you got Frank Foster of Count Basie fame, who's now doing quite a lot of side work. Donald Byrd, Tommy Flanagan, Doug Watkins, and Art Taylor. Outstanding stuff. And it's a record I've talked about quite a lot, so I don't want to dive into it too much. Booker Ervin, another Texas Tenorman. He comes up a little bit later than a lot of the other Texas Tenormen, but he's definitely in that same sound with the big, full, earthy body tone. Just a big, thick sound. And he comes up, he makes a record at Bethlehem and something at Candid, and there's a few other small independent label things that he does. And then he ends up, makes a record at Savoy in the 1960 probably. And those records kind of all skip under the radar fairly unnoticed. But he starts making a series of records at Prestige in probably 63 or 4. And he's there through the end of the 60s before he goes to Blue Note. And again, dates on these are often so hard to come by. 63. This Exaltation record is outstanding. He's got a lot of Coltrane in his sound as well. So you couple that Texas tenor big full sound with some of Coltrane's dynamics and passion playing, you have a pretty fiery player that's going to really set the night on fire. And really any of his Prestige titles are worth having, and they're getting really expensive. In the 73, 74, 7500s, there's not a lot of titles that fetch really high money, and Booker Ervin's titles are some of those titles that really do. Frank Strozier, the fantastic tenor, alto players on this. Horace Parlan of Blue Note fame is on the piano. Butch Warren and Walter Perkins round up the drums and bass. Again, just a great, great session by one of my favorite players. A guy that I probably don't talk about enough is the great Booker Ervin. Charles McPherson, Con Alma. This is number 7427. Great cover. Great player. He doesn't just fit into the soul jazz thing. He's a much different player than that. He's a modern, more edgy player. He's got Clifford Jordan on this with Barry Harris. That right there tells you he's got a bit of a different sound to him than just the soul jazz thing going on. Somewhat like Booker Ervin, he's a bright player, modern player. He's not interested in just doing basic blues. He wants to kind of be noticed. And he comes along in a time, probably 65, where he doesn't get a lot of attention. He makes 3 or 4 at 65. He makes 3 or 4 great records in that period at Prestige that are all worth tracking down. This one I think is a great place to start with. And again, this record even now is going for 50, 60, up to $100. So those are, again, a lot of these records are just getting more and more expensive all the time. The last record I want to talk about is Don Patterson, 74, 84. He has a lot of records at Prestige. He's a great organ player. He's just a fantastic, dynamic. He does some things that make my eyebrows go. You know, he can Jimmy Smith me at times with his dynamics. Vincent Carraro's on the guitar and Billy James on the drums. It's a preview copy, as you can see. Again, these old Don Patterson records are starting to climb in value as well because he's such a great player. He's definitely different than Jack McDuff. You know, there's more virtuosity, more expression, less just groove and feel, and more about intricacy and, like I said, virtuosity. Patterson's a pretty incredible player who has blown my doors off a few times. I'm like, wow. And organ's not an easy thing to play intricately. Organ has a lot of bleed, and the sound sustains, and to have it playing cleanly, well-defined sound and notes, it's a tougher thing to do than I think people realize. And Jimmy Smith and guys like Don Patterson really had to refine and hone that skill set. And that's exactly what they, of course, do. So that right there is 24 Prestige titles that you can build a great Prestige label catalog with and get to know the label. Covers a pretty wide dissection of what the label was about. And I'll say this, like Blue Note, like Riverside, don't pass up old cheap titles whenever you see them. They don't really put out bad records. They might be less famous than some than others, but you didn't get to record in those days unless you really could play. That's one of the things that unify all these labels across the board, across the nation. If you're tracking stuff in the 50s and into the 60s, you weren't there if you couldn't play. They didn't let you in the door if you sat down and didn't know what you were doing. So even the most obscure stuff is guys that know how to play their butts off and have really earned their way to becoming. It's a bit like being a big league ball player. You can make it to the big leagues only for a few weeks in baseball and get sent back down to the minors, but just the fact that you got there meant you had a pretty elite skill set. Because of the 1,000 or so pro baseball players, there's tens of thousands trying to get there. And to get to record in the studio or to get to have a cup of coffee in the big leagues, you had to be pretty darn good to even get close to that place. You know what I mean? You didn't just work your way through the ranks one day and show up and say, hey, I'm on record. You just go in your basement with your cell phone and track some simple beats. These guys were all skilled, hard-working, well-rehearsed players that deserve recognition and appreciation today by us collectors. So Prestige is a great label. In my place, it's probably the third greatest label of this era, behind Blue Note and Riverside. Its body of work is immense, and it's probably close to 1,000 titles once you have the 800, 7,000 series, the 100 plus New Jazz, the Swingville, Moodsville. There's 1,000 titles right there. And then you start factoring some of the status stuff, which a lot of us reissued and doubled up. And then the early 78s and 10-inch era as well. Prestige's body of work is just immense. But a lot of it's out there. A lot of it's sold okay. The later soul jazz stuff sold well enough where you could find it fairly affordably. And the earlier stuff that didn't sell as well and has become more expensive, most of that has OJC reissue, where you can find them for 30, 40 bucks as an OJC, and they sound great. So anyway, my name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.